Hi everyone, welcome back to LaunchPod. In this episode, we sit down with Jaclyn Ling and Shums Kassam, co-founders of Hatchways, a digital platform that helps new grads, self-taught programmers, and career shifters get their first jobs in tech. The pair met while going through our Next 36 accelerator and have stood by each other for years, from building and selling their startup BlynkStyle to working at Kick together and now building Hatchways. We recorded this episode back in early March, and with some of you starting to look to the future, we thought it would be a good time to share their insights into talent and hiring. Plus, they do have an infectious candor and chemistry as co-founders that will, at the very least, make you smile.
Welcome back to LaunchPod. Today I am here with Jaclyn and Shums, co-founders of Hatchways. Why don't we just get started by talking a bit about how the two of you met?
So, I can start. We were both selected for the finalist weekend at the Next 36 in 2013. And we talked to each other a little bit online, expressed kind of what our backgrounds were, thought we would go grab coffee, met at a Tim Hortons up on Bloor. And after 30 minutes of chatting, I think we were already let's start a business together. I think Shums had a different opinion of me when he first met me. He makes fun of that all the time.
I was young and just a third year engineering student, and so I thought, I just need a business person to start a business, and I'm technical, and actually at that time I also had a friend as well. We started as a 3-person team, and then we ended up working together well with Jaclyn, and so we ended up becoming a 2-person team. And so at that time it was just she came in with all this fur and all this nice fashionable stuff, and I didn't know what to make of it. And that's all I still just remember.
He brings
that
it up all the time.
I just remember that.
He's like, "Can I work with this person who dresses like this?" And I'm like, "This."
Yeah. So it was just it's just in terms of first impressions or anything like that. I think it wasn't a lot of thought process put into it. I think it was just business development. We should match, and that's kind of how we thought about it. And it goes to show that you never know who you'd be good at working with and who you'd be jam well with, basically. Yeah.
Amazing. And so did you kind of have an awareness at the time that you were both bringing different skill sets to the table and that was a good thing, or did you grow into that?
I think we had a pretty clear, our skills are really defined and very different. I have no technical background, and I had more of an interest in business and product and networking and talking to people, and Shums and the other partner had a very clear interest in technical expertise and wanting to build products. So there was a pretty clear defined skills differentiation.
Yeah, to also add to that though, I don't think I had a lot of confidence at that time actually in my technical skills, because I started to code actually in university, and this was third year of university, whereas surprisingly the third partner was way more technically sound. But I think that also goes to show I had that desire to build, and I think that's what really I brought to the table, which is I love to build things and kind of go from plan to execution. And I think that was where I fit in with Jaclyn well, because she was really good at planning and actually coming up with the plan and the strategics behind it, and I just love taking that and seeing what we can do with it.
Amazing. I love that. And so when you both met, did you understand what it meant to be co-founders? Was this a novel idea to you? Can you speak a bit about the kind of the difference between co-founders and founders and how you came to formalize that?
It's funny because I think it's just we were in the Next Canada experience, and for the Next 36 program, there was just this idea you join a team and you're co-founders and you're all equal partners in it. And we just went with that. I don't think we really thought through.
I don't think we thought about it.
We didn't even understand the implications going on forward, I think, to be honest. Yeah.
And I think at that time, maybe this was 6 or 7 years ago, I didn't know personally a lot of founders or people who started businesses, so I didn't even really know what it looked like to either be a sole founder or to have a co-founder. I had no examples to look at. I think it was just a given because we were part of the program that's what was going to happen.
Right. Yeah. And so what did you say now? Shums, you talk about not understanding the implications. What does that mean now that you're, how many years are you out from Next 36?
Yeah,
it's 5 years. 5 years, yeah.
I think it's when we started our second business, it was more of a conversation. Do we want to be co-founders? Does Jaclyn want to lead this? Because she left first and kind of started the business first, and then I joined. So it was what kind of role do I want to play? Do I want to be someone that is a co-founder level, or do I want to, which is a serious question, like do I want to be just an engineer, a first engineer? And the role is very different. I think we look at it differently as a co-founder relationship versus employee and founder relationship.
Mm-hmm. And then obviously, just again, for people listening in who may not know much about startup life, like there's obviously an equity piece involved, right? So it is very much a strategic decision that you make to, and I think what a lot of people don't understand too is that, founders after they launch a business can also bring in co-founders after they've launched the business, right? And that person is then entitled to a certain amount of equity, right?
Yeah. That's exactly what happened with our second business. I mean, I think I started brainstorming ideas for 4 or 5 months before Shums joined, but for me it was really important that he came in as a co-founder and as an equal co-founder, especially when you're planning for a business that is going to last for 5-10 years. It doesn't really matter like how much has been done in a few months or in even the first year for that matter. It's more about how much do you build a business together over a long period of time.
I think that kind of interesting around this topic as well is like I didn't understand even the concept of what vesting was when I was doing my first business. So it was like we both went in as founders at that time, but I didn't even understand that there's also vesting for founders and like how does that work even if we leave early, what happens in that situation. And this was all kind of new, and the second time around it was like more of like we had that conversation, we already knew how to do it and set it up. But basically, the concept of vesting is that you don't get all of the equity up front. It's kind of unlocked over time, depending on how long you stay. And so I always recommend to kind of new founders that are, first of all, they're actually their own equity is vested too. But anybody they bring on first, like don't start them off with full access to equity. You make them vest. You have a certain time period when they first get any equity. So we call it like a cliff. Like usually it's like a 1-year cliff. And usually vesting is over 4 years, so there's just standard agreements, and that was something that I didn't even know existed. That was what's funny, like about the first time, and then the second time around it was just like an easier conversation.
Yeah, it's funny because I mean, having spent my career in the corporate world, it's a term that I'm very familiar and comfortable with, having worked at TD or at Google, but
right.
I don't think that a lot of people think about that choice when you take on the founder or co-founder life. Very helpful. And then, obviously, again, you've now had such a fruitful relationship, and I know, definitely speaking to Jaclyn, she's so grateful to have you, Shums, in her life, and it sounds like there's so many benefits to having a co-founder. Can you expand on maybe what some of those benefits might be for someone who's contemplating a similar path?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think the two biggest benefits is I think that one is like motivation and drive and how that feeds off each other, and then two, just like diversity of thought and problem solving. In terms of the first, I think that obviously everyone knows the startup journey is a huge roller coaster. Half the time you're down, half the time you're up, and I think having another person with you on that journey that can share the highs and lows really helps, mitigate the downs, but then also really pushes the highs even higher in a way. And so that's kind of one big aspect of it. It's really lonely to do it alone, I would say. And so having a person who understands it and who's going through it with you is a huge value add. In terms of kind of diversity of thought and problem solving, I mean, I think that me and Shums, as an example, we think about problems very differently. I'm a very high level thinker, and then kind of like to kind of think of all the things that could possibly be, all the different ways that we could solve this problem. And then Shums is a very like bottoms up type of problem solver, and so us talking through problems together, we really get to, I think, a whole range of different ideas that I couldn't get to on my own. And so I think that's a big value add at having somebody who's very complementary in terms of skill set.
Yeah, I mean, to add on that, in terms of our different way of thinking, I always, for those that are kind of computer science background, I always compare it to like a breadth first algorithm, where like Jaclyn's more breadth first, you look at like every option, and then I'm more depth first, like I like to dig deep into one solution area and then kind of go trickle up that way. And so I think that's always been helpful, especially with like my executionary side of my personality versus her like high level strategic thinking side. I think that's always been helpful. I think another thing just to add on that to the benefit of having a co-founder is that we can kind of do a lot independently, and I think that's huge for a startup. Like we don't, because we have like a lot of skill sets that are complementary, we can we don't need to hire somebody to basically iterate on the first iterations of a product, because we can build things, we can sell them, we can kind of do a lot of that, and that's almost like impossible to do independently. There could be somebody that could do it, but it's almost impossible to do independently. And so having the I guess the financial ability to kind of, as co-founders, go in there as equal partners and just hack at something without having no burn is like huge value prop. And even if we have that issue in the future, we can always kind of scale down back to 2. The other thing that is there is like, I think that's like undervalued but is really important, is as co-founders, we can handle raising money really well, because Jaclyn can go completely on raising funding and I can kind of take over leading operations of the business, which is, I think, extremely undervalued, because what I've seen with like sole founders that raise money, you can destroy your team while you raise money because you're removing yourself from the business.
Yeah, I've heard that.
And so that's very dangerous. Whereas as a co-founding relationship, you don't have a founder you have founders that are continue to focus on the business and its growth while you're raising money, which is, I think, a very practical reason to have a founder. And I don't think anybody would be able to take that role as an employee, because they won't be as invested to kind of take on that full responsibility when you're raising.
Amazing, awesome. So it sounds like plenty of reasons in your cases, and I think I'm just being a broken record at this point. I think you're very lucky to have such a complementary relationship, and you're so self-aware about the skills that you each bring to the table. And you know what Jaclyn said earlier, just about how founder life can be so lonely. That is something we hear, and how sole founders, can often feel isolated. To that effect, I know both of you have now gone through 2 accelerator programs, and shifting gears a tiny bit, we don't need to get in too deep to the benefits of Next Canada specifically, but I do think as part of your journey, obviously, your experience at Next Canada and at Y Combinator have served you very well. I'd love if you could talk a bit about, why you think more founders should consider accelerators as part of their journey, in the same token that being co-founders has given you, I don't want to call it a safety net, but a partnership. What are some of the benefits that those accelerators have afforded to you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, Next Canada, I'll be forever grateful, because had it not been for that program, I wouldn't have met Shums. And nowadays, a lot of business founders come to me and ask, like, how do I find a technical co-founder? And I have no answer, because I have no idea how to go about that if you didn't get as lucky as me. It's not as easy as just going to these networking events and then finding someone who's technical and then starting a business together. There's no
like
there's
matchmaking
it's so
app for
it's
that?
so difficult.
Do we have a business idea?
Exactly. Next business.
Yeah.
It's so challenging. So that was absolutely the most value add I got from the Next program, is just connecting with technical people that are also interested in doing startups, and that have been pre-vetted in some way by a third party. For me, for Y Combinator, the biggest value add is getting access to a community and a network that is outside of Canada. For us, it was a huge benefit to have getting connected to investors in the US, and for someone who has no prior relationships, or I don't go there often enough. It's just, that was a huge value add, and boosted our ability to raise capital much quicker, because they gave us access to all the investor network.
Awesome. Do you have anything to add to
Yeah,
that?
no, for sure. I think a different perspective for me on Next Canada, and I think it's because I came to Next Canada without understanding, without believing that I was an entrepreneur, and I still maybe have that feeling. I came in thinking, like, I want to build stuff, and can you do this as a viable, pathway of your career? And so, even backstory, like, I wasn't even knowing I would go into software, so it was kind of like a lot of vagueness kind of getting into the program, and then realizing that this is like a career path for people, and that this is possible, and that this is a good way to kind of jumpstart your career even, and like trying and building things ends up being one of the best ways to learn, even if it's in companies or outside of companies. And so for me, it was like, actually, like, Next Canada was a very big turning point for me to realize that this is a possibility, for me to realize that I can do this, and that I can learn really well, actually, this way, kind of going through a traditional engineering degree and actually pausing that to building my own business, and actually learning that was like a way better learning experience, and I think that's a very good learning experience for people at different stages of their life. So I think I always say this, like, Next Canada is my perspective, and I don't know how much it's changed, but from when we were doing it, it feels like it's an incubator of people. It's not an incubator of startups, and so because of that, they take people that necessarily may not be entrepreneurs, but may be good fits for it, and I think that's a great model, because I don't think I would have been an entrepreneur at all if it wasn't for Next Canada. I don't think that way, and I'm actually not ambitious like that either. Like, I don't have the typical traits of what you would think an entrepreneur is. Like, that's not why I do it. I just do it because I like building things, and so it's not the ambition of, like, building something.
I love that. I mean, part of it is we're not just Next Canada, but it is important that we challenge some of those norms around entrepreneurship, right? Because I listen to you talk, and I see what you've accomplished, and I think entrepreneur, and so maybe that's not what you had set out to accomplish for yourself.
Exactly.
But you're right. I mean, just speaking on behalf of Next Canada, it is definitely part of changing the trajectory of that person's life and saying, okay, you exhibit some kind of raw entrepreneurial ingredient, and just like any good recipe, we're going to take those raw ingredients and put them together and help you find people like Jaclyn, right? And
exactly.
I love that story, and hopefully change the trajectory of your lives. And then I just want to go back to something Jaclyn said, because we have talked a lot about the Y Combinator experience, and again, not about comparing and contrasting Next Canada with YC, but I do think there's a couple things that are really interesting about your story. The first is, obviously Jaclyn does speak quite passionately about what she gained from Y Combinator, and I think you would probably agree on the access to capital and investors, and you always say it. So, I could reach out to anybody, right? Or before you even got off the airplane, you had people reaching out to you, right? So it helped you get a bit of that kind of capital infusion, but then you very consciously chose to come back to Canada. So a couple of questions, I guess. The first is, why come back here, given the access you have in the Valley? And the second is, what do you think what knowledge did you bring back with you that you can help impart on the entrepreneurship ecosystem here in Canada to continue to raise the bar?
I mean, for me, two reasons why I think coming back to Toronto made sense, at least for this stage of our company, is one, we noticed when we were down there, we did a lot of sales and business development, and a lot of our customers are in San Francisco, New York, just within the US, but for our business, a lot of the sales could be done just over the phone and over video call, and so we actually had never met anyone in person to actually close deals, and so we realized that we can actually be quite efficient and effective remote, and so from a sales perspective and growth perspective, that could be done not being there. Secondly, in terms of like talent and hiring, I think the talent in Toronto is great, and I think that it's at such a fraction of the cost than San Francisco. And so I think at the stage of early stage startups, when you're still trying to figure out what you're doing, you want to extend your runway for as long as possible. And so if we can grow and conduct sales remote, and we can hire and recruit great talent at a fraction of the price here in Toronto, I don't see why not do that.
Very cool. Anything to add to that?
No, I think those were the main points on that. Also, I think with our business, we're starting to see that the talent that we focus on, kind of who our main customer base, has been really good in Toronto, and so that's like another reason to add that.
Perfect. Yeah.
Staying here.
I mean, we definitely hear time and time again, be where your customer is, and given the nature of your business model, I'm assuming you still have global aspirations, right?
Yeah.
It's easily scalable.
Yeah.
Before we go a bit further down the Hatchways path, because I do want to get into that, maybe just taking a step back to launching BlynkStyle and then going on to have that business be acquired by Kick. And so I'd love to talk a bit about the acquisition in particular, but first, maybe just for people listening in, you could just give us a sense of BlynkStyle. What was the problem you were trying to solve, basically what was the problem you were trying to solve with BlynkStyle?
So Blynk was basically your personal style is in your pocket. We learned your style through a learning algorithm and recommended you outfits that you could go buy and shop. I think that the problem came out of an experience that Shums and I actually had when we started working together. As he mentioned earlier, I was always into fashion, walked in with fur and like whatever, and so I was like, you know what?
She does have amazing style.
I
Can't lie.
And I said, well, I can't work with someone who dresses like you, so I need to take you shopping, and that's how it started.
Okay, wait, can we pause? How was that for you, Shums? What was your response to this person? You haven't known each other that long. She's like, I'm going to take you shopping.
It was like
I think
2
it
weeks
was-
in, we're like, we
Yeah.
gotta go.
It was a very, this was a business experiment
Yeah.
where we
Okay.
were investigating if this was a problem to solve and to see how we could, build the first, experience for people. And so that's how we looked at it. And we ended up actually scaling our business off of the idea of like Jaclyn being what we first started with, and like her actually personal styling people, and then we went from that to what does that look like as a mobile app. So
Yeah.
Amazing.
that's
So it
kinda
was
how
really the
started.
experience of like taking Shums shopping, realizing with, a small budget you can actually put together a bunch of outfits that could be really stylish. And we did that. Shums actually bought a bunch of stuff. I put together the outfits. He would go out and he would get, I swear I remember, he got like random compliments from people
Yeah,
on the
it's true.
street that he'd never gotten before, right? Like random people on the street would stop and be like, oh my God, I like your pants, or something like that. And I personally saw that as like,
You're like, great, now strangers are talking
Yeah.
to me on the street. My nightmare.
but it was kind of like, how can we replicate that experience for people online so that they can all have access to that kind of personal styling experience? That's kind of how it came about. Yeah.
Great. And then, as you're kind of, this is during Next 36,
Yeah.
and you're sitting there saying, okay, we're building this product. We found the problem we're going to solve. We're gonna launch a product. What was your vision at the time? Did you know that at some point you would want to have, be approached about an acquisition, or, what were kind of your goals that you were striving for at the time?
I mean, I don't know if we actually ever had that conversation of saying like, this is our goal. I think personally, I saw this first company as I really want to learn as much as I can and soak in as much of this experience and knowledge as possible, because I know I'm going to start another company afterwards. And so I don't know if I had the confidence back then to say that this is the company I want to build to be $1 billion company at that time. I think I was taking it more as a learning experience, and so I think that the best outcome that could have been for me was an acquisition in a short period of time, because I gained the confidence I needed to go on to do this next business, and I just got to learn the different complexities of starting a business, growing, working with a team, getting acquired, all of that in a very short period of time. Yeah.
Gotcha. And I mean, I ask for a couple of reasons, because the first is, in a traditional business setting, the notion of an acquisition, if you're working even at Google, you're not thinking like, okay, I want to get acquired. You're thinking revenue, you're thinking sales, that kind of a thing. And I think the second piece is that, one of the narratives that we keep coming back to is, what does success look like as an entrepreneur, and what are all the different paths, right? Because, we talked about this with Michelle Romano in a previous episode, and she said, the decision to sell a company or not is as personal as the decision as having a baby or not, right? And I think that more Canadians need to understand that, yes, we want to build headquarters in Canada and we want to grow and scale companies, but oftentimes, as I think has maybe been your case, if you have that exit, it allows you to go on and get more confidence and build something even bigger, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's how we were seeing it, right? Like, I think I bucketed it into, one, what can this do for us in the future? Two, what is the opportunity that we have at hand? And I think the specific company that was acquiring us, the industry that it was in, the opportunity that they had presented to us seemed really at the forefront of technology and the industry, and so that was also an interesting part to it. And the third is actually, we had talked to one of our mentors about this and said, a mentor who had got his company acquired, and asked, how did you make your decision? And I remember he had just posed the question, is this going to be life-changing for you or not, right? And I think that at different stages in your life and different amounts of money can mean different things to you, but at that stage when we were kind of evaluating that, we did feel like that was going to be a life-changing experience, which in retrospect it definitely was. And so those were kind of the ways we were, I think, looking at the opportunity.
Okay, and so did Kik approach you?
So we had actually been working with them on their platform. We had launched one of the first chatbots on their platform, and it was fairly successful. So we basically used the technology and experience that we had built on our app and recreated that into a chatbot experience, which was a very new platform for them at the time. They had select partners that they kind of opened up the platform to launch experiences in. We had built one of the first chatbots there. It was quite successful, and basically at that time they said, we really want to build this platform out and see what chat can do. We think you could be a good team to do that. We also want to delve more into the fashion and retail industry because their target was US teens, and fashion and retail is a big part of their life and experience. So they wanted to get partnerships with fashion brands that we were talking to, and so in that way it was a natural kind of partnership because of that.
Very cool. And then so the acquisition happened, and then you both went and worked at Kik for a while. For how long?
I did just under 2 years.
Okay, and
I did about 2.5 years.
And what did your roles look like there?
So I started off as doing head of like retail and fashion in the bots category, and then eventually I was head of partnerships, and then in my last little while there I was doing product for the bots platform.
Yeah, I started off as I think just like an engineering manager. I can't remember if there was any like particular part that I was managing, just like actually the fashion and retail bots, and that makes more sense. And then moved on to the engineering manager of the bots platform. And then near the end started working on like Kin, which was Kik's cryptocurrency, and integrating that into our messenger, and that was kind of like the roles that we had over time.
And I mean, Kik is a fantastic company, and I know it's Ted Livingston, right? And I've heard fantastic things about him. So here you are, you're kind of in, you've got this great company wrapping their arms around you. Why launch a second company, let alone together? Can you talk a bit about that?
I mean, I think I had always known that a second company was going to be like the next step. I never saw myself working for someone for too long. I think that, why start a company, why work on your own thing is obviously everyone has their personal reasons. For me, I think the amount of impact that you can have building your own company, I don't think you can have that kind of impact working for someone else. The amount of freedom that you have in terms of deciding what problem you work on, who you work with, how you work, what's the environment you work with, that amount of freedom is only something you can create if you start your own thing. And I think the last thing is just the high growth experience that you get, both professionally and personally when you start your own company. Right. The rate of growth when you start your own company is just so high, and I think that's something that really drives me.
And for me, it wasn't as clear that I would kind of start another company. I think it's kind of very similar though in terms of reasons why. I think it's just like the intersection of being able to do what I love, which is like building things, but also do it for a purpose that I can define is very, very compelling, and you can't find that outside of entrepreneurship really. It's hard. It would be hard to find that exact fit, and I think just always been interested in kind of Hatchways' purpose and mission, and being able to build something like that, and knowing that there's like very little resources out there for our kind of candidate pool that we work with has been phenomenal and a very like blessed experience, because it's like where can you find where you can do what you like and do it for a purpose that you like as well. It's very
totally
hard.
And so for Hatchways, in terms of how you came up with that idea, were there any more weird social experiments? Did Jaclyn make you
we actually had
an interview for roles? And
we had a pretty funny way of how we started that.
Yeah, do you want to explain what
you can explain.
We actually just like launched a boot camp as the beginning. That was a free boot camp where, our space is like education to employment. So how do you get your first job, being kind of completely new to a field? It sounds self-explanatory if you go through the traditional routes, but the traditional routes don't exist for everybody. So non-traditionally, if you're getting a non-traditional way to get into software engineering, for example, it's hard to get your first job, and I think a lot of people listening in will kind of resonate with this. It's hard to get your first job, and there's not many opportunities for you, and so we thought, why don't we understand this space a little bit more, and actually build our own web development bootcamp. Super naive thinking we could also build one in a shorter time frame than existing ones and still have a high placement rate to jobs and all of this, and so we ended up building a free one that was focused on we focused on interesting demographics in terms of who we would attract for this, and we ended up actually building and focusing more on the second pieces. Is once they're done the boot camp, how can they get a job? And so that's where kind of Hatchways grew into that.
To give context and a fuller picture, within when Shums left Kick, we had 4 weeks to recruit who was going to come to this boot camp in which we have no qualifications to do. Shums had to come up with the curriculum. We had to find a place to run it all in 4 weeks. We basically did that. So Shums was a first-time instructor, and then I was a first-time recruiter, headhunter to get these people jobs. And it was, again, the demographic we focused on, we thought, let's try to focus on a demographic that would be the hardest to get jobs, to actually understand the issues. And so half of our group of people were newcomers and immigrants to Canada, so had no networks, even maybe not fully fluent in English. And the other was low income / poverty line type of group of candidates who had really hard times to kind of make ends meet. So it was a very interesting experience where we really got to understand the problem of it's actually so challenging if you don't come from a traditional background and don't look like your cookie cutter candidate on paper, how to actually get a job, even in a category like software where there's such a high demand for talent.
We also learned that we should have, one of the challenges is 8 weeks or however these boot camps are long. It's hard to learn that skill in that amount of time, and nowadays we're seeing this more often, but there is kind of pre-selection processes for these boot camps as well, because you kind of should come in with that very high passion for the space, already have taught yourself a bunch of things before you can say you're boot camp ready or ready for it. And so we just didn't do a lot of that, and we had a lot of challenges that we faced in that experience.
But I kind of love that you just went for it, right? And you tried it, and you probably learned a ton from that experience. And so how long ago was that? That was
2 years
ago.
2 years ago.
Yeah.
So what does Hatchways look like today?
So Hatchways basically helps startups hire Moneyball tech talent, which is basically highly talented but overlooked software developers. And we do this by evaluating candidates on their practical skills rather than their resume or interview skills. And so in this process, we're really able to empower hidden talent while helping them launch their tech careers.
Very cool. And, you talked earlier about learning curves and career switching. And, when I heard Jaclyn speak at National Selection Weekend, I think your journey struck me as one that was just so non-linear. Yeah. And I loved your story about having applied for the job at L'Oreal. She didn't get it. And then however many years later, she's in a room presenting to a room full of executives, so at L'Oreal, saying, well, hey, look at where I am now, look at everything that I've accomplished. But, how has your own experience as, a so-called career switcher informed the Hatchways product and how you can empathize with the people that you're trying to help?
I mean, my story is so relevant to what we're building now. I don't believe that the way people interview today reflects if someone can do the job and will they be a good fit. I think so much of it is biased and creates so many barriers for people from all different backgrounds. I was the type of person that, I could get interviews because I could network or I came from a branded school, but when put in the interview, I was always a mess. I'm what do I showcase? Do I say what I think they want me to say, or do I say what's true? It was never the right process for me. I was a highly anxious person. I'm actually very big introvert, and so like those experiences for me was never the right way to evaluate can I do the job, and it really crushed my confidence going through that process of constant rejections and thinking that I couldn't do the job. And it was only till so many years later when I was like on the other side of the table doing interviews and meeting people did I realize this has nothing to do with like can this person do the job.
Yeah, and I mean, who hasn't been
Right.
in those moments, right? Like I will tell you right now, I've had so many of those moments in my career. I remember interviewing for jobs at Google. I mean, I didn't get the first one that I interviewed for, and I had always worked in more traditional banking industries, worked in advertising, and I just thought like, I can't do this.
Yeah.
You know, this is totally out of my wheelhouse. And then you still, once you're in Google, you know, they talk about imposter syndrome, and then it just kind of like, it does haunt you. But I think what you're doing is wonderful, that you're kind of giving people the confidence to switch careers. Do you have, you know, to that effect, I'm sure you've at this point helped a lot of people who may not have those shiny degrees pivot into tech careers. Can you talk about a few of those stories that have stood out to you?
I mean, for me, some of my favorite stories are a lot of the immigrant stories. We have a lot of immigrants that come to Canada or the US. They come with no network. They come with like, again, a credential that is not recognized by North American companies, but they're so hardworking. They are talented developers. We have immigrants coming from Russia, Ethiopia, Ukraine, and coming from completely different backgrounds like accounting or electrical engineering, and then landing their first jobs here, and we were able to really be part of that process and see them grow over the span of a year or two. And it's really crazy what the career trajectory can go from their first job until like a 1 year later. We've seen like 50% like pay growth over even the span of 2 years, which is amazing.
It's amazing.
Yeah, to echo that, I mean, my experience on understanding the Hatchways problem is more on the kind of having hired non-traditional talent and seeing how they actually excel over time. And so like a lot of co-ops that I've hired ended up being, you know, short term. You kind of can test them, and they come from not just software engineering or different types of engineering, and you end up being like, wow, these are really good hires. And it's really hard to categorize why is this a really good hire, because humans are complicated, and part of that is like, it means that, you know, there's so many things to look at when you're looking at a hire, and I feel like we kind of hone in on one. So a lot of the stories that I like are, you know, candidates where it's like, I just had the wrong read on them, and then they ended up wowing and surprising me. So anecdotally, we've had a candidate that we put a spreadsheet on, like we put them through these work simulations to see how well they would actually be able to practically do the job. And so I created a spreadsheet saying like, let's make the teams based off of how well we think they did, and the person that was at the very end ended up being the person that I ranked the worst in that cohort ended up being the strongest candidate. And their story is just very compelling. Started immigrant, like Jaclyn mentioned, came to Canada and did a degree, one of those degrees that are postgraduate programs that are actually just designed for you to stay in Canada. They're not designed to teach you the right skills. So they learned very archaic technologies like PHP and things that you wouldn't get a job here with. And so they did that program, actually got like a 4.0 in it, excelled tremendously in it, went through the interview process, couldn't get a job, tried for maybe like a few 3 months, ended up working at Tim Hortons for 2 years, and then came back and found us, was hesitant as usual because, you know, it's always hesitant trying a new platform, ended up doing one of our courses, and then was our strongest candidate, got a job through that experience, and we could see that huge trajectory. And they just don't realize how valuable they are as a resource. And when you're trying to go in the traditional job market, trying to find a job in the traditional way, even I was biased towards them from how well we thought in terms of what technologies they could use and how they approached problems. They just needed that right coaching. It's very, very discouraging for them, and to a point where people will actually like forego a degree and they have the qualified software skills and end up working in Tim Hortons, and we've seen that with multiple candidates. Yeah.
That's so wild. And then what about on the part of employers? Like, how can they think differently about talent? Because I mean, we've all been there and reviewed resumes, and you know, obviously from a marketing perspective, it's not quite the same, but you're still looking to check certain boxes. So part of it is retraining the way they think. So what does Hatchways do on the supply side to influence?
I think I'll start with that, and the best way is like hire someone first and you'll experience it, because once you've experienced it, you can kind of see the value prop. And I think we get biased not just from non-traditional talent pools or vetting and like pre-screening. Our biggest issue is actually like people want senior talent and they don't want junior talent. And I think our best example is actually a company I was talking to today, and they hired their first 2 engineers were both Hatchways graduates with no prior work experience. But when we met them, they were like, we only want senior talent. And the way to get past that perspective is like, well, why don't you trial them on the job first and see how well they can actually perform on the job? And why don't you test these candidates in any way you can? So we have to just sort of like anything that they're doing poorly on the side of like, you know, their background, or your confidence can increase in them once you just like give them a practical test and see how well they excel in it. And I think that's always changed my opinion too. So when we interview candidates or we go through any process, we never do a purely behavioral screen, because the fear of doing that is like you're actually vetting the candidate on something that people with disabilities will fail. People with, you know, they're not good at like that part of the communication. When are you ever going to be doing a purely behavioral as a software engineer? Even presentation is different than a purely behavioral interview, right? And
I come from like an arts background and like cannot handle the tell me about a time when questions.
I know.
and you know,
I apologize to my team if I ask those questions in an interview process, but your brain is so hardwired now to ask. Like in business school, they're all about behavioral questions.
And you know what increases my confidence is when I interview them and I ask them technical questions, and then they get so excited and they can answer those well. As long as you have that component, you know, you may need to ask behavioral, but if you ask technical at the same time, you know, your confidence in them can be boosted if they have that, you know, this practical skill that you're looking for.
Yeah, I love that. Well, I know we're almost out of time, so I just want to end by saying I think the product you're creating is solving a very real problem. I mean, for us at Next Canada, where we do kind of take a leap of faith just to bring things full circle back to where you started from, right? It's like you maybe didn't see yourself as an entrepreneur, and sometimes it just takes someone taking that risk. And so what you're building with Hatchways, like you're almost creating a much more data-driven and enabled path to follow a tech career and help people upskill. And I just really appreciate the work that you're doing to kind of reframe the narrative from an employer perspective as well. And, you know, I wish you both so much continued success, and I can't see what you continue to build, and definitely please stay in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for tuning into LaunchPod. We're so proud to be part of this community doing such great things to move our country forward. But our reach only goes as far as your support. So please download and subscribe to amplify the voices doing the hard work to advance Canada's entrepreneurial ecosystem.